This is Dr. Rob Harder with the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast, Making Your World Better. What does it take to be an effective nonprofit leader today? What are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest obstacles? How should nonprofits fundraise in an economy that is constantly changing? All of these reasons combined led me to start this show. And it's my hope that through this series, people can learn not only what it takes to be an effective nonprofit organization, but to hear from effective leaders who are successfully making a positive impact in their communities. We hope you enjoy the show, as together we hear how they are making their world better. When it comes to Habitat for Humanity, I think the first image that comes to many of our minds is Jimmy Carter swinging a hammer on a hot summer day as he's building a Habitat home with others. Well, President Carter certainly has been the face for Habitat for many years now. But what's behind this organization that consistently has one of the strongest nonprofit brands in the country? Well, my guest today is current CEO of Habitat for Humanity International, Jonathan Reckford. Jonathan has served in this role for 18 years now, and he's really guided the organization to new heights, both in terms of how many homes they've provided all over the world, but also in the realm of advocacy when it comes to housing affordability. Jonathan will share his leadership insights with us on a whole variety of topics, and he'll also give us the full scoop on what they did with Mackenzie Scott's recent $436 million gift. Now, before we get to the show, I just want to give another shout out to each one of you, my listeners. I have so enjoyed hearing from many of you, and really, you're the reason this podcast is growing. So thanks for listening. I just want to say again, if you have suggestions for the show or ideas for guests, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Just send me an email at nonprofitleadershippodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's nonprofitleadershippodcast@gmail.com. All right, now on to the show. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business. Well, Jonathan, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Glad to be with you, Rob.
Absolutely. Well, we're really glad to have you on the show. And this show is dedicated to nonprofit leaders, as you know. And there's no doubt that in the face of America's dual public health and economic crises, many nonprofits have struggled to meet increased demands for services while also confronting decreased revenue and donations. Increased expenses, staffing shortages, the list goes on. We could talk about the great reshuffle. There's just a lot of moving parts right now, and nonprofits are really stuck right in the middle of that, I believe. So why don't you talk a bit about how you've been able to navigate through all of these challenges facing nonprofit organizations today, because you lead one of the largest nonprofit organizations in the country. So I'd love to have you talk more about Habitat.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rob. And it is first, start on the bad news and then talk about some of the better news. I don't want to depress everyone. I think COVID was unique for any of us. We have faced all sorts of man-made natural disasters all across the US and across the world, but we've never had the whole world impacted simultaneously. So I don't think anyone who was under 100 years old had any context for this. And it was really difficult, and we had to pivot pretty dramatically. I think to the heart of your question, the worst part is it exacerbated the economic divide that already existed. So we already had this huge division of people with assets and without assets. And suddenly COVID kind of turbocharged that. If you were a knowledge worker who owned your home and had a stock portfolio, there was a lot of negatives about COVID, but you're actually much richer at the end of COVID than when you started. Yeah. And you were somewhat insulated from so many of the challenges. If you're a service worker without assets, COVID was a catastrophe. Jobs went away. Your rent skyrocketed, your cost of food went up, and your health risk skyrocketed as well. So it really took existing trends and made them worse. And I think the need for our services exploded, as you say. One, minor bright spot, but now we're in a more uncertain economic time, is charitable giving went up. And I think we certainly, like many nonprofits, expected quick recession. I think the counterintuitive part was that a lot of people, as I mentioned, who had assets suddenly couldn't go travel, couldn't go out to eat, and perhaps saw the need and suffering out there. And so we didn't expect it, but in fact, giving went up for us. I also think housing became more visible. So the issue of housing may have been more visible as everybody was in their home or all wanting more real estate and thinking about what it meant to have a safe place to live to ride out a pandemic. So, but what we have seen is a huge stretch. And now, with a more uncertain economic time, again, the need, it's countercyclical. The need goes up as resources potentially go down. there was also a huge amount of government spending that I think cushioned and the short term, but probably is unsustainable. So it is. I think we're in a complex time for the next few years in our sector.
Well said. And it's interesting. I do want to talk a bit about the housing crisis because that seems to be very much front and center for everybody and every demographic all across the country. But there is no doubt, as you mentioned, the COVID challenge was a very difficult challenge for all of us, for profit and nonprofit, but especially those I think are leading organizations that depend on the generosity of those, in our community. Now, you're right. I've had many guests on the show that talk about this, and definitely the trend showed that charitable giving was up, which is tremendous. But however, I'd say the end of last year and the beginning of this year so far, that trend's starting to go maybe back to normal or back down, thinking, hey, we're past the COVID crisis. I really gave some extra to support my favorite nonprofit or Habitat for whatever organization they love. But now I need to get back to normal giving because I've heard that now that now the question will be, how will this year be? Will people continue to be quite as generous as they've been the last 2 years? Leadership is so critical, and a crisis can really test our leadership, right? And I know Habitat for Humanity faced many challenges during these last couple of years. So maybe you could talk about what was your biggest leadership lesson going through COVID?
It reinforced a couple of things. One, from the challenge side, the need for housing exploded. The cost of housing exploded. You had supply chain challenges. Suddenly, everybody wanted more housing. So all of that went the wrong direction. And though it's actually a small percentage of the families we touch, our volunteer work had to stop altogether, and our retail stores, which are a important source of revenue for especially our U.S. and Canadian affiliates, all shut down for 60 to 90 days, and then slowly ramp back up after that. So there was a huge shock at the front end. I would say that the first lesson reinforced one of my favorite leadership lessons, which is we should be religious about our principles, but not our tactics. And we had to go virtual almost instantly. We had to help our affiliates and country programs think about, how do you do construction in different ways? How do you continue to help families in a context suddenly? And so, we had affiliates very quickly pivoting to building with only those weekly volunteers that are almost like staff, with their professional staff and with contractors, rather than the traditional way of building with Habitat, thinking about how to be safe and pivot in an uncertain time. And I think the other side to me, which so many people have said, is the don't waste a crisis. So how do you, given you've got the crisis, how do we then use the sense of urgency to do things maybe that would be hard to do when you don't have a crisis? So we started to think deeply about, can we now build the infrastructure? One of the big themes for us is, can we build more? But we know that as many Habitat, we helped about 7 million people last year globally, but we'll never build enough to solve the housing crisis. So we need to build more, but also influence more. And this really was a real push to help our countries and affiliates dive even deeper into advocacy and to thinking about, how do we make markets work better for low-income families, and really thinking about impacting the housing ecosystem. And so I think the using the crisis to do hard things is an opportunity that comes out of these tough times.
It's interesting you mentioned that because it's true. We didn't just face a health challenge or a revenue challenge or a staffing shortage challenge. Additionally, it seems like we're definitely in the midst, in America anyway, a very divisive time in our country. Just feels like we're getting more and more divided, and social media probably is part of that reason. But as we face that, I think good for our listeners to hear, because Habitat, I think automatically people think, oh, you build lots of homes all over the world, but you do a lot more than that. You talked about the advocacy piece, you do a lot more. And so I thought it'd be interesting to hear more about the role that nonprofit leaders can serve when it comes to being bridge builders in our communities, particularly during times where we're feeling like we're getting more divisive. I know Habitat has done quite a bit of that. Could you speak to that in general, how nonprofit leaders can do that, and then how specifically is Habitat doing that?
This is a passion area for me. I'm so glad you asked about it. It is, I actually gave a public lecture on this in the fall in Minneapolis, and it's easy to diagnose. And then the question is, what do we do about it? So first, very quickly on the diagnosis side, if you're a politician or you're in the media, you actually get paid and rewarded for making people scared and afraid. So the political system and the media system are both driving people out to the edges and creating division. And I think civil society and the nonprofits are somewhat the antidote to that. And my comment is that service, community service, really is the antidote to polarization. And while Habitat is a housing organization, for those of you, your listeners who've ever been out on a Habitat build site, I think that experience on the build site or so many other worthy service experiences out in the community is what community is supposed to feel like, but too rarely does. And we've got so many people now, especially with COVID, who are sitting at home and getting more and more anxious and more disconnected from their community, and then bombarded with messages about how the people who are of the other political party or who are different are not just different, they're bad, they're terrible. And in the preface to my book, shameless plug, President Carter, who's one of my heroes in this space, wrote about how after a natural disaster, you don't care if the person rescuing you is of a different faith, of a different gender, of a different religion or ethnicity. You're thrilled they're there to help. And his comment is, why can't we be like that without the typhoon, hurricane, earthquake, or war, and treat each other? And when I first got involved with Habitat, I was working for the Walt Disney Company. A very long time ago, 1992, I think, and we sponsored houses in Orlando, Florida. And Disney would spend lots of money on what I would call artificial team building, but the experience of coming out with my team and spending a day putting siding on a house alongside the family that was going to purchase that home was such a powerful experience. And then, many of us then came back and kept volunteering because I do think when you're serving together, you focus on what you have in common as opposed to what separates you. And I joke, I have built with blacks and whites in South Africa. I've built with Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, Hindus and Muslims in India, Christians and Muslims in Egypt. I have even built with Democrats and Republicans. So it shows anything is
anything is possible.
But I do think it's when you serve that you create the basis for trust and relationship. And then you can have hard conversations about difference. Then you learn, but it creates that space for relationship. And so actually Habitat was asked by the White House along with the YMCA and Interfaith America, and now we've added Catholic Charities to create an intentional program called a Nation of Bridge Builders. And we hope to actually widen the net once we get it started, but a commitment to use the work we already do with even more intentionality to build bridges. So in Habitat's case, we'll use our AmeriCorps, we'll use our interfaith work, and we'll use our specifically our work around race and bridging around racial difference, add more intentionality so that as people have that volunteer opportunity, we also want to create dialogue in ways that actually help advance bridging, because I do think this is desperately needed in our society.
Boy, well said. I would love, definitely curious to hear more how that develops. So congratulations to be a part of that and be invited to help form that. Well, Habitat, and even as I say the name, that has one of the strongest brands of all nonprofit organizations in America, and I would say probably even in the world. And yet I know that your goal has been to continue to expand and grow Habitat's mission and impact. In other words, when you came into your role, you didn't just want to settle in and say, hey, we've kind of made it. We're there. People know about us, that we have a good brand. You've really tried to, through your connectivity, your resilience, and your partnership, you've really tried to inspire further growth in the organization. So talk a bit about that. How did you go about doing that? And what were some of the key decisions that have led to your success so far?
It's hard to believe this is year 18, but
wow, okay.
It has been a joy being part of Habitat. And the first, I just did an awful lot of listening. And it was interesting. When I showed up, I had my 100-day plan. I was going to go around the world. I was going to meet. And then about 5 days before I was officially supposed to join, Hurricane Katrina hit the U.S. So my plan went out the window. But in some ways, the combination of that plus the tsunami in Asia, per our conversation around COVID, forced us to do things we wouldn't naturally have been able to do. Suddenly, instead of building a few houses in thousands of locations around the world, we needed to build a lot in a few locations. And that forced us to think very differently about how to build and scale. And the work where we helped about 25,000 families after the tsunami, wow, and where we were, for many years, the largest home builder in the Gulf Coast after Katrina, taught us a lot about scaling. And then we tried to, how do we take those lessons when you're allowed in a crisis to do things that might have been culturally taboo without a crisis? And then the next step was, in a way, changing our framing question. And our very good framing question was, how many houses can we build? What we changed to was, what would it take to meaningfully reduce the housing deficit in every geography that we serve? Which is a much more scary question, but then forced us really to think, okay, to really, if we're serious about that, we've got to build relationships with the government and change land use and change property rights. We've got to work with the private sector for financing and building at scale. We've got to think about solving market barriers that have actually stopped low-income families from being able to upgrade and improve their own housing. So that led us first into a huge advocacy effort around property rights, especially for women and disadvantaged groups around the world. That then led to our big bet, which was to get the microfinance industry to start lending to very low income families for home improvement. These are families that wouldn't have enough income for even a $2,000 or $3,000 mortgage in a place like Cambodia or Malawi, but could afford, if they could get it, a small loan that might let them get a cement floor for the first time instead of a dirt floor, get a proper roof, get water sanitation for their home, get an extra room so the girls and boys could be separated and maybe run a small business out of that on the side. And we did experiments with that, lending our own capital and training microfinance banks. Then we raised a wholesale fund that actually just won a major award from the United Nations for one of the most effective development. We raised a $100 million fund that's directly helped 1 million families get home improvements, but also leveraged hundreds of millions of dollars of additional capital and really started to demonstrate that there's a market for the microfinance industry in housing. So that's been exciting. And then we jumped to the next step of the value chain, and we've been working around skilled labor and building materials. So the goal would be, if you're a family now, you can have the right to stay on your land, you can have access to a loan, and then how do you get value for money with the money you borrow so that you could actually do a good home improvement? And we're testing still, but we're in Kenya and Philippines. We're actually running a home improvement TV show to teach families about how you might do home improvement. We found that was actually a more effective way than trying to directly train people. And we have been working with, in Mexico, we have an app that allows people to identify and rate local masons so they can figure out who's a good local mason or contractor to hire. So we've been trying to learn, but with our Center for Innovation and Shelter and our tech accelerators, we've actually been investing with and supporting entrepreneurs who are coming up with new building products that are better products for the low income families who are trying to serve. So that is not instead of our traditional home building work, but it's a way that's in a way how we went from helping thousands to helping millions per year.
We'll be right back. Are you looking for an easy and effective way to boost your nonprofit's donations? Look no further than DonorBox, the online fundraising platform that streamlines your fundraising efforts, maximizes donations, and simplifies giving for your supporters. With DonorBox, you can create beautiful donation forms, accept digital wallet payments, track donations, and send auto receipts. And the best part? There are no setup or monthly fees and no long-term contracts required. So what are you waiting for? Visit donorbox.org today to get started. That is donorbox.org. Are you ready to revolutionize your advocacy efforts and significantly impact policy change? Discover Quorum and level up your advocacy to better educate more lawmakers. Quorum is the only unified public affairs platform that empowers nonprofits to map, track, change, and report on the policy landscape, all in one place. Explore how Quorum Grassroots helps nonprofits create compelling campaigns in minutes. The result? Your nonprofit doesn't just participate in the advocacy, it drives it. Quorum, where influence meets innovation. You can learn more at quorum.us. Hey friends, and thanks so much for listening to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I want to let you know that I've recently become a professional certified coach. With my nearly 30 years of nonprofit experience, I know firsthand how hard you work as a leader. I also know how important it is to have someone you can call on to get help with the barriers, the leadership challenges that you will face both professionally and personally. And I really want people to thrive, to become all they were meant to become by providing coaching and consulting services. So if coaching is something you've always been interested in, but maybe weren't quite sure what it was all about, I encourage you to reach out. You can go to my website, robharder.com, or just email me at rob@robharder.com. I would happy to provide a free sample coaching session so you can determine if coaching is for you. All right, thanks again for tuning in. Now back to the show. Very impressive how you scaled it and provided some really creative ways to do that. No, very impressive. Well, and then adding to some good news to you, last spring, I learned that Habitat was the recipient of a $436 million, I'll say it again, $436 million gift from Mackenzie Scott. I know that was got quite a bit of PR around that. Congratulations, first of all. That's huge. That is a wonderful gift. And I know Mackenzie Scott has been super generous. I've had multiple actually guests on the show who've been recipients of her as well. Big Brothers Big Sisters, for example. Now, it's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime gift, though, for any organization, particularly, medium to smaller organizations, that would be unheard of, right? So I'm curious for you, obviously you're a big organization, but even for you, that's a large gift. How has that changed your organization, and how have you managed that gift so far?
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, we are incredibly grateful. And that vote of confidence, as I told our network, this just shows how important housing is, that that Ms. Scott would identify and give her largest gift to date to affordable housing. And obviously, it's a great vote of confidence that when she wanted to help affordable housing, she picked Habitat. That's the wonderful news. About of the 436, 425 went directly to 84 of our affiliates. And so for each of those affiliates, it's the biggest gift they've ever gotten. And it's unrestricted, which is quite
Oh,
extraordinary. So
fantastic.
high vetting and then these big unrestricted gifts, which allows them to actually think about the kind of change I was just talking about. So now, if you're in this market, not just how many more houses can we build, how could we be a force for affordable housing in this market, in this city, and start to think about some of the, so often nonprofits are chasing and never can invest up front. And that, so well, Rob, the nonprofit starvation cycle where you're punished for investing in people or systems and you're rewarded only for outputs.
Yeah.
And this allows, I think, for that group to really build strategic plans to not just build more, but have that higher level of influence, which is really exciting. Now, there's a slight piece which many of my federated friends know too. That also means 90% of the Habitat affiliates did not get a giant gift, so there was
right.
some sadness there. And then 25 million came directly to HFHI, which again, extraordinary. And what we are using that for is to really help the system move and grow. Some needed, it's kind of infrastructure investments that are hard to raise funds for. We have a major initiative that's a huge equity issue around advancing Black home ownership in America. And there's a long, painful history around discrimination in housing, and we want to be a piece of that. And we're investing and accelerating a campaign that we had already started called Cost of Home, which is really trying to bring awareness and action at the state, local, and federal level around better housing policy. So those are a few of the things that we are directly investing in or able to do faster. I think we would have done all these things, but we can do them faster with this wonderful injection.
Thank you for sharing that. And I can tell just that you're very thoughtful, and it's interesting. You mentioned a couple of things there, but I thought 25 million to really invest in some of the infrastructure and things that are so critical to the success long-term of your organization, but it's hard to fundraise for. You're right. I mean, I know of every small to medium-sized and even large nonprofits, it's difficult often to invest in staff, invest in capacity building, infrastructure for your organization. And yet those are the very things that often help you scale and move forward and really go to another level with your nonprofit. So I'm impressed you did that.
It's where, if I can just add to that, Rob, it's one of my observations, having spent first part of my career in the private sector and then moving into church work and then coming to Habitat. In the private sector, my whole career was growing new businesses in big companies. And we would launch a new business and we would build the leadership team for what that business was going to become. And in the nonprofit sector, you're always chasing. And it's very tough to afford to invest in the leadership that you need for the level of growth. And, the reality is every time you double in size, you need a different level of leadership. So you've got to invest in your current people and help them grow. And you've got to be able to attract new people as well. Very tough in the nonprofit sector to be able to afford to do that. So these really strategic investors like Mackenzie Scott, I think, are forward looking around, pick good quality organizations, and then give them the flexibility to invest where they most need to take the next step forward.
Love that. No, well said. And I think that is something we've had multiple conversations with various guests on the show about that very thing. And so I'm glad you are doing that. You're practicing it. And it's good just to continue to get that out there, that is something, particularly for donors, that is so important to nonprofits. And so those unrestricted gifts are so critical. Well, as you think about this year, and as we've talked about the housing situation, it does seem like the housing crisis really has hit everybody, every city, every state. And so it's a big deal and it's on people's minds. And I think the housing crisis ends up impacting so many other things. So one of the things I think I mentioned before the show started, I lead a nonprofit and we serve 2 food pantries that we offer, and we serve people who really do need food, but maybe when the root issue is they can't afford the housing, and the housing continues to go up. And so rent is going up, and just the ability to buy a house is like almost becoming impossible in certain pockets. And so that housing crisis impacts their entire financial portfolio, so to speak, and impacts their entire life, their entire family. You obviously have a huge impact on millions of people when it comes to housing. So as you think about this year, when it comes to the most important aspects of Habitat's work and priorities in 2023, how are you seeing improvement in the near future for the housing crisis? And what are you doing to really alleviate that?
Yeah, it is so first, to emphasize the point you made, which is it's all so interconnected. And we certainly would never argue housing is the only need, but in many ways, housing is a prerequisite for so many other things. If a child doesn't
Yeah,
have stable, safe, and affordable housing, then she doesn't stay healthy, she doesn't do well in school. There's a
that's
whole
right.
series of negatives. So it is such a critical building block. And actually, Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies just came out with their most recent data, and it's so sobering. It's the worst in US history for families being cost burdened. Over
Oh,
half of
wow.
American families are paying more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgage, meaning
Wow.
they're having to make incredibly difficult choices about what they don't have money for: health, education, and all the other needs. And so we have a huge supply problem. After '08, we underbuilt as a country for a decade. And now, depending on which study you pick, we are between 3 and 6 million units short of housing.
Wow.
And zero rates actually created distortion where the private markets started buying up housing. Everybody suddenly wanted more housing during COVID, and we saw not just the sort of crazy markets, the New York and California and Hawaii, but suddenly the Charlottes and Atlantas and Dallases and Tampas
Uh-huh.
that were historically very affordable markets, they went up 30 to 50% in 2 years. So
Wow.
shocking increases,
Wow.
which again, if you already owned your home, you're celebrating. For everybody else, it's really a disaster. And then the supply chain issues actually stopped us from building as much as we should have been building even during it. And then now, as interest rates have gone up, that has dramatically worsened the affordability because there aren't enough entry level houses. The prices are too high. And then, if instead
Right.
of a 3% mortgage, it's a 6% mortgage, that's actually a 30 or 40% increase in your monthly cost of housing. So you put that together, and the answer is we have got to build much more. So our first priority, not just for Habitat, but for the whole sector, is we've got to build more housing at the entry level and workforce and affordable levels. And so my challenge to all our U.S. affiliates in the U.S. context is we need to come up in your local community, come up with a plan to double your own production, because we've got to build more, but that will be insufficient. Double your own production, and how you're going to be a partner and catalyst in your community and market for significantly growing the overall supply of housing, because we need more supportive housing, rental housing. Habitat's particular niche is affordable home ownership, and we need more of that. So many young families, there just is no inventory that they can access or afford. So our hope is, with the market now slowing down because rates have gone up, that there might be an opportunity. There's capacity in the market, but can we get the math to work? And it's going to take probably cities subsidizing land, and then developers can make the math work to come in and build affordable housing with nonprofits like Habitat. So we have a number of federal initiatives as well as local and state that we hope could start moving the needle for both preservation of housing and the creation of lots of new housing. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, you have that sounds very good. I mean, I've had so many conversations with our local community, mayors, city council, county council, about these issues, and I like what I'm hearing. That sounds like you really, again, are providing a lot of different layers of support, and both on the advocacy side, again, and also literally building homes for families. And this next question, I thought it could relate to Habitat, but I'm thinking even broader now as we think about looking on the horizon, say the next year to 3 years. When it comes to the nonprofit sector in general, as a whole, what do you see as the biggest challenges facing the nonprofit sector?
I think, and it's interesting, I chair a group of the CEOs of the largest US nonprofits, and we've been talking a lot. I think multiple challenges. One is cost of good staff has
Hmm.
skyrocketed in the last few years. So in a way, the costs have gone up and the need has gone up. And the great fear in suddenly an uncertain economic environment is there'll be a squeeze where governments are asking nonprofits to do more and more, but then not coming in with the investments to make that possible. So in some ways, I think that's front and center. I
Okay.
actually think it intersects with some of the cultural things that we talked about a little bit earlier on the show,
Yeah.
which is there are a couple of trends that are a little concerning. More giving is happening the last number of years, but it's by fewer and fewer people. I think that's a bad sign for civic, for the long term. And civic participation is down, and people are feeling more lonely, more divided, more separated. So I think in some ways it's both the opportunity, but a desperate need is how do we increase civic participation, increase engagement, and get people out in their communities in a way that helps them to see the need and be part of it. And certainly housing, I think the place housing intersects with this is where housing is also critically important. And we know the data is so clear that mixed income, mixed use is the right way for cities to work. And historically, the way they work, it's a relatively recent phenomenon that we've become so economically segregated. And that is a racial correlation. But in some ways, the big risk now is we're creating this permanent economic divide, and that's not going to be good for society long term. So, how do we think about making sure that the American dream really is accessible for everybody? And that's going to take all the different parts and pieces. But it's particularly important that we think about how do we make sure that this housing is affordable in communities of opportunity. If we did that well, then people wouldn't actually fight gentrification as hard because there'd be more, they'd have more options. And then hopefully, when people get engaged in the community, that's how hearts get changed, because then it's not those people, it's relationship. Then you might say yes in my backyard, as opposed to our incredibly bipartisan view that nothing should be built near my house.
Right, exactly.
I'm in favor of affordable housing somewhere else, and you see it certainly in Park City. What a good example! The resort areas are really tough, and ultimately it's an economic block. You can't hire people if they can't get housing.
That's right.
And so I do think it's where I'm now hearing from mayors, which is very different than 5 or 10 years ago, that number one, or tied for number one with crime, housing's top of their agenda right now.
Yes.
Because of these issues. It's complex and expensive. So I didn't mean to delve back into housing, but I do think it's going to be in suddenly a time where federal spending is likely to get squeezed because debt service is going to eat up more and more of the federal budget. And that may translate, if we have suddenly a slower economy, states have been awash in federal funding, that's going to start sliding down. So I think the funding pieces is going to be a huge issue for the nonprofit sector. And then I think the second step, which may be the opportunity as well, is the lines are blurring. And I do think the nonprofit sector, it's an opportunity now to think about impact at a higher scale. And I think it's needed. How does how can we make sure the nonprofit sector has a full seat at the table with the private sector and the public sector? Because these complex issues can't be solved by any one sector.
Quick side note, I've helped put together a mountain town coalition of nonprofits that are based in mountain towns, specifically because there were so many during COVID is when I reached out to various leaders. And I mentioned that it's because the housing issue, as you mentioned, was a common denominator. Now, initially it was COVID. How do we respond to COVID? Getting food to people, providing mental health counseling. But housing was this huge issue. And like you said, it's becoming such a big deal in every single mountain town, every resort town in the country. But what's interesting, it's almost like a microcosm of what's going on in the country as a whole. And so, sometimes when you have a little bit of a smaller population area like we do in this mountain town, if you can get your hands around it, sometimes that gives some ideas to how you can scale that in bigger cities. So all to say, interesting what you're doing. I think my listeners are going to be very interested in finding out a little bit more about you and, of course, about Habitat. So how can they do that? What's the best way for them to connect with you and find out more about Habitat for Humanity?
Well, thanks, Rob. I think the fastest is if you go to habitat.org, you can learn more about the issues and what we're working on, but also learn more about the organization and learn how you can get involved. And I think one of the myths of Habitat, I always laugh about what people don't know. Everyone thinks Habitat, and they think Jimmy Carter, who clearly put Habitat on the map, and they think we give away houses. So the reality is President Carter did put us on the map, but did not start, nor does he run Habitat. So he is my hero. Second, we don't give away the houses. I think if people don't know, I think what has been core to making Habitat successful over the years is that the families partner with Habitat. And that means they put in sweat equity, helping build their homes and their neighbors' homes. They take classes in financial management and home maintenance. And then they demonstrate clean credit and the ability to pay back an affordable mortgage that's tagged at no more than 30% of their income. And that's why we've had such extraordinarily low foreclosure rates over the years. And what we've seen is not everybody should own a home, but in many ways, owning a home has been that power move that's allowed especially low-income and low-income minority families to build an intergenerational asset over time. And that's been powerful. But it is, but I would certainly agree too that this is one piece. The other myth, I think, is that the only way to help is to come out and bang nails. And we love, do come out and have that community experience. But we also need field volunteers, and we need financial help and legal help and accounting help and family consulting and retail help and all the other pieces. So I certainly would welcome folks getting involved.
Well, again, Jonathan, thank you for taking time to be on the show. Thanks for your leadership, too, for all you're doing. You're truly impacting millions of people all over the world. So I appreciate you taking time and, again, sharing your insights with us.
It's a pleasure, Rob. Great to be with you.
You bet. Hey, friends. Well, I wanted you to know that this podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to other podcasts. I also want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. This will actually help us get this great content out to more nonprofit leaders just like you. You can also join the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast community. Find other resources and interviews of past guests all on my website, nonprofitleadershippodcast.org. Well, thanks again for listening. And until next time, keep making your world better. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Go to YouTube and look up Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. We'll see you there. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business.